Hey guys, welcome back to Survival Roots. I'm standing here in what looks like a completely normal modern living room. Outside, it's a brutal 95 degrees Fahrenheit, about 35 degrees Celsius. And suddenly, the power grid goes down. The central air conditioner doesn't just slow down, it dies. Within 2 hours, this modern house, this sealed drywall box we like to call high-tech shelter, has turned into a greenhouse. The air is stagnant, sweat is running down my face, and that cheap plastic box fan on the floor is completely useless. All it can do is blow the same hot, heavy air straight back at me. Does that sound familiar? The moment the grid hiccups, or the electricity bill shoots through the roof, we suddenly realize how helpless we've become inside homes that simply cannot breathe. But it wasn't always this way. Let me take you back to July of 1934. We're in the middle of a historic Midwestern heatwave, the kind of scorching, dry weather that killed livestock in open fields. A thermometer hanging on the shaded porch of a Kansas farmhouse reads a blistering 108 degrees Fahrenheit, more than 42 degrees Celsius. But step through the front door, and something remarkable happens. You feel relief. Inside the parlor, the temperature is holding at a comfortable, steady 78 degrees Fahrenheit, about 25.5 degrees Celsius. No electricity, no compressor, no freon, no monthly cooling bill, just raw, brilliant, elegant physics hidden inside the architecture. How was that possible? How could a farmhouse built with axes and hand saws in 1880 outperform a $500,000 suburban house built more than a century later? The truth is that we didn't simply outgrow these brilliant low-tech designs. We were talked out of them. Beginning in the 1950s, a massive commercial machine spent millions of dollars redefining naturally self-cooling homes as outdated, old-fashioned, and unrefined. Why? Because a house that cools itself doesn't generate a monthly cooling bill. We were encouraged to trade generations of architectural knowledge for a compressor connected to a lifelong subscription. Today, we're taking that knowledge back. We're opening the archives of vernacular engineering and counting down 20 forgotten home designs and cooling tricks that kept people comfortable long before air conditioning became part of everyday life. Strategies you can still use today to reclaim some energy independence and dramatically reduce the amount of mechanical cooling your home needs. Hit that subscribe button, grab something cold to drink, and let's dive deep into the survival roots of architecture. Section 1. The Wind Tunnels, Dogtrot and Shotgun. We begin our countdown with a masterclass in aerodynamic floor planning. These houses didn't simply wait around hoping a breeze might appear. Their layouts were shaped to capture moving air, direct it through the building, and turn the structure itself into part of the cooling system. Design #1. The Dogtrot Breezeway. Our first design takes us into the hot, humid American South of the 19th and early 20th centuries, from the Appalachian Mountains all the way down into the lowlands of Louisiana. It's called the Dogtrot House, and at first glance, the layout looks almost too simple to be intentional. A traditional log home was divided directly through the center into 2 separate living cabins. One side was commonly used for sleeping, while the other contained the hotter, more active spaces such as the kitchen and main living area. Builders then stretched one continuous roof across both halves of the structure, while leaving a wide, open-air hallway running straight through the middle. That central passage became the heart of the house. The name Dogtrot supposedly came from the farm dogs that naturally wandered into this shaded, breezy corridor to sleep through the hottest part of the afternoon. But that hallway wasn't simply a comfortable place for a dog to lie down. It functioned as a passive wind engine. When moving air reached the side of the house, the central opening gave it a direct path through the structure. As the breeze was funneled into the narrower passage, the airflow accelerated through the corridor. The faster the air moved through the Dogtrot, the lower the pressure became within that central space. And that is where the design became powerful. Because doors and windows from the adjoining rooms opened directly into this breezeway, the pressure difference helped pull warm, stagnant air out of those interior spaces, while replacing it with fresh, moving air. The result was essentially a self-generating wind tunnel running through the center of the house. Instead of every room depending on a separate fan or mechanical system, the layout itself helped move air across the occupants and through the building. Even when the surrounding landscape felt almost still, the central passage could make whatever breeze existed far more useful. And this idea hasn't completely disappeared. Modern sustainable architects have brought the Dogtrot concept back into contemporary homes, especially in warm coastal climates. The basic principle remains the same. Divide the home into separate wings and create a large central passage where air can move freely. The modern twist is flexibility. Large folding or sliding glass walls can open the center of the house during pleasant summer weather, allowing natural airflow to pre-cool the building. When conditions become too humid or uncomfortable, the glass can be closed and a modern high-efficiency cooling system can take over. It's a perfect example of ancestral architecture working together with modern technology instead of competing against it. Design #2. The shotgun house layout. From the rural landscape of Appalachia, we move into the dense urban neighborhoods of 19th-century New Orleans, where we find one of the most misunderstood low-cost cooling layouts ever built, the shotgun house. Because these houses were inexpensive and often associated with working-class neighborhoods, they were frequently dismissed as crude symbols of poverty. But thermally, the layout was remarkably intelligent. A typical shotgun house was extremely narrow, sometimes only around 12 feet wide. The rooms were arranged one directly behind another. The living room sat at the front. Bedrooms occupied the center. The kitchen was usually located at the rear. There were no long side hallways cutting through the floor plan. To move from the front of the house to the back, you walked straight through each room. The name shotgun comes from the famous legend that you could stand at the open front door, fire a shotgun, and the blast would travel straight through every room and leave through the open back door without touching a wall. Whether or not anyone actually tested that story, it perfectly illustrates the real cooling advantage of the design. There was almost nothing inside the house to obstruct airflow. The front door, interior doors, and rear door could all be aligned along one continuous path. When the openings were positioned correctly, moving air could enter the front of the building and travel directly through the entire house. The structure essentially became one long ventilation channel. With both the front and rear doors open, differences in air pressure between the windward and leeward sides of the house helped pull air through the rooms. Fresh air entered from the shaded front porch, moved directly across the occupants, and carried accumulated body heat and indoor humidity toward the rear of the building. The genius of the shotgun house was that none of this required expensive equipment, no complicated framing, no mechanical fan, no electricity. The cooling system was built directly into the shape of the floor plan. For working families living through hot and humid New Orleans summers, that simple alignment of rooms and openings could make the difference between stagnant indoor heat and a house that continuously breathed. Section 2. Convective engines, transoms and double-hung windows. Now let's move into Section 2. If you study homes built during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you'll quickly notice that doors and windows weren't treated as simple openings for daylight. They were active ventilation tools. Builders understood that warm air naturally rises, cooler air settles lower, and carefully positioned openings could turn that basic movement into a continuous cooling system. Design #3. Operable transom windows walk through almost any historic home built before 1940 and look directly above the interior doors. There's a good chance you'll see a small rectangular glass window mounted above the doorframe. Today, if one of these windows survives, it may be painted shut, covered by drywall, or treated as nothing more than a charming decorative detail. But originally, that little piece of glass had a very practical job. It was called a transom window, and it played an important role in ventilating the house. The principle behind it was extremely simple. Heat rises. Warm air is less dense than cooler air, so it naturally moves upward and begins collecting near the ceiling. As sunlight heats the roof throughout the day, the rooms underneath gradually become warmer. That rising heat can accumulate along the ceiling until a deep layer of hot air develops overhead. Now imagine closing your bedroom door at night. You might want privacy or security, but once that door is shut, the warm air rising inside the bedroom becomes trapped. Hour after hour, that layer of heat continues building. Eventually, the uncomfortable hot zone begins reaching farther down into the room. The transom window gave that trapped heat somewhere to go. Builders placed a small operable window above the door, usually high enough that it could be opened using a long pole or simple hardware. You could close and lock the bedroom door while leaving the transom slightly open. The hottest air near the ceiling could then escape through the opening into the higher central hallway, where larger ventilation currents carried it away. That meant privacy could be maintained without completely stopping airflow between rooms. Transoms became common in homes, hotels, schools, row houses, and offices. They were inexpensive, mechanically simple, and capable of performing their job for decades. Then central air conditioning became common. Once homes began depending on mechanical cooling, builders increasingly sealed these openings or stopped installing them altogether. A feature that had once been considered a functional part of the building slowly became a decorative reminder of an older way of designing houses. And today, we often use complicated ventilation equipment to recreate the same basic principle that a hinged pane of glass once handled automatically. Design #4. Double-hung windows used right. Your house may already contain our next forgotten cooling feature. The strange part is that many homeowners have never actually used it the way it was designed to work. I'm talking about the double-hung window. Many modern windows are single-hung. The lower sash slides upward, while the upper section remains fixed. But on a true double-hung window, both the upper and lower sashes can move. Unfortunately, in older houses, the top sash is often painted shut after decades of repainting, leaving homeowners with only the lower half operating. But your great-grandparents understood that both moving sections had a purpose. A double-hung window could function like a two-way ventilation valve. Open the lower sash several inches, then lower the upper sash several inches. Now you have one opening near the bottom of the window and another near the top. Cooler outdoor air, being denser and heavier, can enter through the lower opening. As that cooler air moves into the room and settles downward, warmer interior air is pushed upward. That warm air can then leave through the opening at the top of the same window. You've created a continuous convective exchange through one opening in the wall. Cooler air enters low, warmer air exits high, and the cycle continues. You don't necessarily need a powerful cross breeze. You don't need an electric fan. The difference between cooler lower air and warmer upper air helps drive the movement. Housekeeping guides from the late 19th century even taught families how to adjust their windows throughout the day, as outdoor conditions and sunlight changed. Operating windows was part of operating the house. Today, we often sit inside rooms designed to remain permanently sealed while a large mechanical system works to remove heat that previous generations attempted to release naturally. Section 3. Shading the glass. Eaves and canvas awnings. Section 3 deals with one of the biggest sources of summer heat entering a house: direct solar radiation. The basic rule of passive cooling is simple. Keep sunlight away from the building before that energy becomes indoor heat. Once intense sunlight passes through the glass or heats the exterior walls, you're already fighting a much harder battle. Design #5. Deep roof eaves and overhangs. Walk through an old historic neighborhood and look carefully at the roof lines. On many houses built before 1940, the roof doesn't end directly above the exterior wall. It continues outward, 2 feet, 3 feet, sometimes even 4 feet. Those deep roof overhangs, or eaves, weren't simply decorative. They acted as carefully positioned climate barriers. Traditional builders understood something very basic about the sun. During summer, the sun travels high across the sky. During winter, it stays much lower toward the horizon. That seasonal difference means one properly sized roof overhang can perform two completely opposite jobs. During June, July, and August, when the summer sun is high overhead, deep eaves cast a broad shadow down the face of the building. Windows remain shaded. Exterior walls receive less direct sunlight. The structure absorbs less solar heat, but when winter arrives, the sun approaches the house from a lower angle. That low winter sunlight can pass beneath the same overhang and enter through the windows, warming the interior when the family actually wants that heat. One architectural detail serves two different seasons. No motors, no controls, no electricity, just geometry. A properly shaded south-facing window can remain dramatically cooler than glass, exposed directly to summer sunlight. But after World War II, housing construction changed rapidly. During the suburban building boom, developers discovered that shortening those large roof overhangs saved lumber, time, and labor on every house. Across enormous developments, those small savings multiplied. The result was millions of homes built with shallow roof edges and windows left exposed to intense summer sunlight. Instead of the roof preventing much of that heat from reaching the building in the first place, homeowners increasingly depended on air conditioning systems to remove the heat after it had already entered. The roof used to fight that battle before the compressor ever needed to start. Design #6. Canvas window awnings. Look at photographs of American residential neighborhoods and city streets from the early 20th century through the 1950s. And one detail immediately stands out. Awnings were everywhere. Green and white stripes, orange and cream fabric, canvas shades hanging over window after window, until entire streets looked almost festive. But this wasn't merely decoration. Those awnings were part of the cooling system. To understand why they worked so well, think about what happens when sunlight passes through your window. Most modern homeowners try to control heat with interior curtains, drapes, or blinds. But once sunlight has already passed through the glass, much of that solar energy is already inside the house. It strikes the floor, furniture, walls, and other surfaces. Those surfaces absorb the energy and warm up. The heat is now inside the building. An exterior awning attacks the problem much earlier. It blocks direct sunlight before the rays ever reach the glass. That difference is crucial. Instead of allowing the window to absorb intense solar energy and then trying to manage the heat indoors, the awning creates shade outside the thermal envelope. Exterior awnings can dramatically reduce solar heat gain through windows, particularly on south and west-facing exposures. In the 1920s, families could install a basic canvas awning over a window and use it for years. As summer approached, the awnings came down. When cooler seasons returned, they were rolled back up. The house essentially changed its clothing with the seasons. Then residential air conditioning became widespread. Awnings gradually disappeared. Canvas came down. Compressors went in. And homeowners began paying every month to mechanically remove heat that an inexpensive piece of exterior shade had once prevented from entering in the first place. Section 4. Outdoor sanctuaries, deep porches, and sleeping porches. Now we move into Section 4. When summer became truly unbearable, previous generations didn't always retreat deeper into the house. Instead, they created outdoor living spaces that blurred the boundary between shelter and landscape. These weren't simply decorative porches. They were extensions of the home's cooling strategy. Design #7. Deep wraparound porches with haint blue ceilings. The deep southern porch may be one of the most recognizable symbols of traditional hospitality. But beneath the rocking chairs and relaxed social atmosphere was a serious piece of passive climate engineering. A large porch wrapping around 2 or even 3 sides of a house and extending 8 to 10 feet outward performed several jobs at once. First, it created shade. Think of the porch roof as an enormous umbrella attached to the building. Instead of direct sunlight striking the first-floor walls and windows, those surfaces remained protected beneath a permanent band of shadow. Second, traditional porches were often raised above the ground on stone, brick, or timber supports. That allowed air to move underneath the porch floor. The soil below remained shaded throughout the day and could stay significantly cooler than the sun-baked yard only a few feet away. When a breeze approached the house, it passed through this shaded zone before reaching the open windows. By the time the moving air entered the rooms, it had traveled across a cooler surface. The porch wasn't simply somewhere to sit. It became a thermal buffer between the hot landscape and the interior of the house. And then there was the famous porch ceiling color known as haint blue. Within Gullah Geechee tradition, pale blue porch ceilings were associated with protection from haints, or harmful spirits. The light blue color also visually resembled the open sky. Over time, the idea developed that this appearance could discourage insects, such as wasps, hornets, and spiders, from nesting underneath the porch roof. Whether families thought of it spiritually, practically, or both, the porch became a shaded, comfortable outdoor room where people could spend long summer afternoons, while the house behind them remained open to ventilation. Design #8, Elevated Sleeping Porches. The Airplane Craftsman. If there is one room that has almost completely disappeared from modern floor plans, it's the sleeping porch. Between roughly 1900 and 1930, sleeping on the upper floor of a house during July could be miserable. All day long, the roof absorbed solar heat. After sunset, that stored heat continued radiating downward toward the bedrooms below. Second-story sleeping spaces could remain uncomfortable long after the outdoor air had begun cooling. At the same time, the early 20th century saw the rise of a major fresh air movement. Doctors encouraged people to spend more time breathing outdoor air, and sleeping in well-ventilated spaces became increasingly popular. Architecture responded with the sleeping porch. This was usually a screened room on the second floor, often positioned on the side or rear of the house. Instead of solid walls on every side, the sleeping porch remained open to outdoor air through large screened openings. Beds or simple cots were placed directly inside. Certain craftsmen and arts and crafts homes pushed the idea even further with what became known as the airplane bungalow. In these houses, an elevated bedroom or sleeping room projected above the main roofline, almost like the cockpit of an airplane. Windows surrounded the space on multiple sides. That high position placed the sleeping quarters directly in the path of stronger night breezes, above much of the stagnant air closer to ground level. On hot summer nights, families could move into the sleeping porch and let continuous airflow carry heat away from their bodies. The skin could release heat into the cooler night air, while breezes moved across the beds. For children, summer nights could feel almost like camping outdoors without ever leaving the house. Then central air conditioning spread across the country. Many sleeping porches were enclosed and converted into ordinary rooms. Others were removed altogether. A once common architectural solution vanished, as mechanical cooling made it possible to seal the bedroom and control the temperature with a compressor. Section 5. Harnessing the Earth, Cellars and Pier Foundations. Section 5 takes us beneath the house. One of the most powerful tools our ancestors had against extreme summer heat was already sitting directly under their feet. The earth itself. Design #9. Cellar living and the root. Cellar. While the surface of the ground can become brutally hot beneath summer sunlight, soil temperatures several feet below the surface remain far more stable. At roughly 6 feet underground in many temperate climates, the Earth stays relatively cool throughout the year, commonly remaining somewhere around 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, about 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. Before electricity, families took advantage of this natural stability. Nearly every traditional homestead or farm had some form of root cellar. It might be excavated into the side of a hill, it might sit beneath the kitchen, or it might exist as a separate underground chamber. The space was protected from warm outdoor air and connected to the exterior through small screened vents. Apples, potatoes, preserved food, and other supplies could remain cool through summer without mechanical refrigeration. But during severe heat waves, the cellar became more than food storage. It became refuge. During the devastating heat of the Dust Bowl years, when dangerous summer temperatures struck cities and farms alike, families sometimes moved parts of everyday life underground. Mattresses, daybeds, rocking chairs. Children could sleep on blankets spread across the cool cellar floor. Instead of mechanically producing cold air, people simply moved into a part of the structure that was already connected to the stable temperature of the earth. It was geothermal cooling in its most basic form. Dig once, use it for generations. Today, we spend enormous amounts of money installing sophisticated ground source systems designed around the same fundamental idea. Use the relatively stable temperature below ground to reduce the amount of energy needed to condition living spaces. Meanwhile, many modern basements remain sealed, heated, and used primarily for storage, while the occupied floors above depend almost entirely on mechanical cooling. Design #10 raised pier foundations. Travel along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts of the United States and look at historic cottages from places like Charleston to Galveston. Many of them do not sit directly on the ground. Instead, they rise above it on brick, stone, or heavy timber piers. Some are elevated only a few feet. Others stand dramatically higher. That open space beneath the building was more than structural convenience. It played an important role in climate control. First, raising the house moved the primary living spaces higher into the path of stronger breezes. Air near ground level could be stagnant and humid. A few feet higher, moving air became easier to capture through windows and porches. Second, the footprint beneath the house stayed permanently shaded. The building itself protected the soil from direct solar radiation. That created a cooler pocket of air under the floor. As breezes traveled beneath the structure, they passed over shaded ground and along the underside of the floorboards. The airflow helped remove heat from the floor from below. Inside, the wooden flooring could remain surprisingly cool under bare feet, even during the hottest part of summer. The raised design also separated the timber structure from damp ground conditions. By the middle of the 20th century, slab-on-grade construction became increasingly common. Instead of lifting the house on individual supports, builders poured large concrete slabs directly near ground level and constructed the house on top. It was fast, it was economical, it required less complicated framing. But concrete also behaves as thermal mass. It can absorb substantial amounts of heat and then release that heat slowly over time. The older pier-supported house approached the ground differently. Instead of attaching the living floor directly to one massive slab, it created a shaded, ventilated zone underneath the structure. Section 6. Thermal isolation, summer kitchens and functional shutters. Now we enter Section 6. So far, we've looked at capturing wind, creating shade, and using the temperature of the earth. But our ancestors also understood another important principle. Sometimes the easiest way to cool a house is to stop putting so much heat inside it. Design #11. The detached summer kitchen. During the 18th and 19th centuries, cooking wasn't as simple as touching a button or turning the knob on an efficient modern cooktop. Preparing food often meant operating a large cast-iron stove fueled by wood or coal. Bake bread, roast meat, boil water, spend hours canning summer produce. That stove could release an enormous amount of heat into the surrounding room. During heavy use, a wood cookstove could contribute tens of thousands of BTUs of thermal load. Put that kind of heat inside a closed house during the hottest part of summer, and the result was predictable. The kitchen became unbearable. Nearby rooms became hotter. Bedrooms could remain warm deep into the night. Families solved the problem in an extremely direct way. They moved the stove outside the main house. The detached building became known as the summer kitchen. It was usually a small structure, placed a short distance from the back door. From late spring through summer, cooking moved into this separate space. Heat from the stove stayed there. Smoke stayed there. Steam from boiling and canning stayed there. The main house remained cleaner and cooler. Then winter arrived, and the process reversed. Cooking moved back into the primary house, where the same heat that had been a serious summer problem became useful. The stove could cook dinner and help warm the family at the same time. Eventually, gas and electric ranges produced far less waste heat than traditional wood-fired cookstoves, and detached summer kitchens gradually disappeared from ordinary residential design. But look at high-end houses today: outdoor kitchens, patio cooking areas, dedicated grilling stations. In many cases, we eliminated a practical survival feature and later brought essentially the same concept back as a luxury amenity. Design #12. Functional exterior wooden shutters. Look at a typical suburban house built during the last few decades, and you may see shutters mounted beside the windows. But look closely. Many are plastic. They're screwed permanently against the siding. They have no working hinges. They cannot close. And some aren't even wide enough to cover the window if they could move. They are decorative fossils of something that used to be functional. Traditional exterior wooden shutters were working pieces of climate equipment. They were properly sized to cover the entire glass opening. They were mounted on hinges, and they could be opened or closed as sunlight moved around the building. During summer, the shutters acted as adjustable exterior radiation shields. In the morning, shutters on the eastern side of the house could be closed before direct sunlight reached the glass. But unlike a solid wall, louvered shutters contained angled slats. Those slats could block much of the direct solar radiation while still allowing air to pass through. That meant the window behind the shutter could remain open. Shade and ventilation could happen at the same time. As the sun moved westward, the eastern shutters could reopen while western shutters closed. The family effectively followed the sun around the building, keeping the hottest windows protected throughout the day. During winter, shutters could also reduce exposure to cold wind. During storms, they provided physical protection for vulnerable glass. All of those functions came from wood, hinges, and simple hardware. Section 7. Thermal batteries, thermal mass and inverted clay pots. Section 7. Focuses on the building materials themselves. Previous generations understood that walls and roofs weren't merely barriers, separating indoors from outdoors. The materials could absorb heat, delay its movement, release it later, or prevent it from entering at all. In other words, the structure itself could act like a thermal battery. Design #13. Thick thermal mass walls. Adobe, COB, and rammed earth. In the high deserts of the American Southwest, summer afternoons can climb above 105 degrees Fahrenheit, more than 40 degrees Celsius. Then night arrives, and temperatures can fall dramatically into the 50s. For centuries, Pueblo, Spanish, and territorial communities lived in structures made from some of the simplest materials imaginable: earth, clay, straw, water, adobe, cob, rammed earth. The secret was thermal mass and thermal lag. An adobe or rammed earth wall might be 2 or 3 feet thick. That huge amount of dense material could absorb tremendous amounts of thermal energy. But the heat did not instantly travel through the wall. Imagine the desert sun striking the exterior surface early in the morning. The outer layer begins heating first. Energy slowly moves deeper into the material. But because the wall is so thick, the process takes hours. That delay is thermal lag. In a properly designed thick earthen wall, the delay can extend for much of the day. So while the outdoor temperature reaches its brutal afternoon peak, the inside face of the wall remains comparatively cool. Instead of instantly transmitting the heat indoors, the mass continues absorbing and delaying it. Hours later, often after sunset, that stored heat finally reaches the interior side. But by then, the desert outside has cooled dramatically. The heat that was unwanted during the afternoon becomes useful during the cold night. By morning, the wall has released much of its stored energy and is ready to begin the cycle again. The building is constantly shifting heat through time. Compare that with a lightweight modern wall. A thin-framed assembly can respond much more quickly to changing outdoor temperatures. The earthen wall behaves differently because it possesses enormous thermal memory. It absorbs the day slowly, then releases it later. Design #14. Clay pot roofs, the inverted terracotta deck. Thick walls can protect the sides of a house, but the roof faces another problem. It sits directly beneath the summer sun for hour after hour. Flat concrete and asphalt surfaces can become extremely hot, storing solar energy and radiating that heat toward the rooms below. Traditional builders in parts of the Mediterranean and South Asia developed an ingenious low-cost solution: the clay pot roof. Before finishing a flat roof or deck, builders arranged large numbers of hollow, unglazed terracotta pots upside down across the surface. The pots were placed close together, in a repeating grid. Then they were locked in position beneath a relatively thin layer of lime-based material. Thermally, the design worked through two powerful ideas. First, every inverted pot trapped an enclosed pocket of air. Because the hollow pot interrupted the continuous path through the roof assembly, heat could not move downward as easily as it could through a solid mass of dense material. Instead of one thick, uninterrupted slab conducting heat toward the ceiling below, the roof contained thousands of small insulating air spaces. Second, the finished surface could be coated with white lime plaster. The bright white finish reflected a large portion of direct solar radiation rather than absorbing all of it into the roof. The result was a roof assembly designed to fight heat in two different ways: reflect part of the sunlight before it entered, then slow the remaining heat before it reached the rooms below. And the materials were remarkably simple: clay, air, lime. Instead of sophisticated manufactured insulation systems, builders used basic natural materials to create a roof that defended itself against the sun. Section 8. Ancient Aero-Engineering, Badgers and Turkish Kumbas. Section 8 takes us into some of the most sophisticated wind harvesting architecture ever developed. Long before digital modeling and computer simulations, builders in desert and Mediterranean civilizations shaped buildings around the movement of air. These structures didn't simply contain rooms. They inhaled. Design #15. Desert windcatchers. Badgers travel to the ancient Persian desert city of Yazd in Iran and look toward the skyline. You'll see tall rectangular towers rising above the rooftops. These are badgers, commonly translated as windcatchers. For centuries, they helped ventilate homes, palaces, and water storage structures in one of the harshest climates on Earth. Near ground level, desert air could feel dusty, stagnant, and extremely hot. Higher above the rooftops, however, the air moved more freely. The windcatcher reached upward to intercept that moving air. Some towers rose dozens of feet above the house. Openings near the top were positioned toward the prevailing summer breezes. When wind struck the tower, the opening captured it and directed it down a tall vertical masonry shaft. The airflow descended toward the occupied rooms below. Along the way, it passed beside thick masonry surfaces within the tower. Those surfaces remained relatively protected from direct sunlight and could absorb part of the heat carried by the air. In more sophisticated versions, the incoming airflow was directed across underground water. That water might come from a qanat or a subterranean pool. As dry air moved across the cooler water surface, evaporation helped reduce the air temperature while adding moisture to the extremely dry desert environment. The cooled air then entered the interior rooms. At the same time, warmer indoor air was pushed toward higher openings on the opposite side of the building. The entire house became part of a ventilation loop. Air was captured above the roof, directed downward, cooled, moved through the rooms, then exhausted back outside. No electrical fan, no compressor, just wind, masonry, water, and carefully shaped architecture. Designs #16 Turkish Kumba, windows. Now we move into the dense, winding streets of traditional Ottoman neighborhoods. Here we find a beautiful projecting architectural feature known as the kumba. A kumba is a wooden bay projecting outward from an upper floor, often extending over the narrow street below. From the outside, it looks like the perfect place to sit with coffee and watch daily life unfold. But its shape also gave the room an important ventilation advantage. Inside tightly packed urban neighborhoods, buildings stood close together. Narrow streets interrupted wind patterns and created pockets of stagnant air. A flat window built directly into one wall works best when the breeze approaches from the right direction. If the wind travels parallel to the wall, much of that moving air simply passes by the opening. The projecting kumba changes the geometry. Instead of one flat window surface, it creates several exposed faces. Windows can open toward the front, toward the left, toward the right. Now the room has a much better opportunity to capture wind approaching from different directions. If the breeze comes down the street, one side can catch it. If the direction changes, another window can become the inlet. The opposite opening can act as an outlet. Modern airflow modeling has shown just how dramatically projecting window bays can influence ventilation. By carefully choosing which windows remain open on the windward and leeward sides, occupants can direct moving air through the room instead of allowing the breeze to slide past the building. A stagnant upper-floor room suddenly gains access to air moving outside the flat wall surface. The kumba wasn't merely a decorative wooden box hanging over the street. It was a three-dimensional wind collector. Section 9. Solar convection. Solar chimneys and functional cupolas. Section 9 introduces one of the most elegant ideas in passive cooling. Instead of treating the summer sun only as an enemy, what if you could use its heat to power the ventilation system itself? That is exactly what these designs do. Design #17. Solar chimneys. Imagine a ventilation system that becomes stronger as the sun becomes hotter. That is the basic idea behind the solar chimney. The structure is surprisingly simple. A tall vertical shaft is built along the sunny side of the house, often the south-facing wall. Its exterior surface may be covered with a dark, heat-absorbing material or enclosed behind glass to intensify solar heating. When intense summer sunlight strikes the chimney, the column of air trapped inside becomes extremely hot. As air heats, it expands. Its density decreases, and the hot air begins rising rapidly. Because the upper end of the chimney contains an exhaust opening, that heated air escapes through the top. Now something important happens lower in the system. As air leaves the chimney, pressure near the base drops. The lower part of the shaft is connected to the occupied rooms of the house. That pressure difference begins pulling warmer indoor air toward the chimney. As stale air is removed, replacement air must enter somewhere else. So cooler outdoor air is drawn through shaded openings on another side of the building. The stronger the solar heating inside the chimney, the stronger the upward movement can become. The sun is literally powering the draft that removes heat from the house. Instead of using electricity to spin a fan, the system uses solar radiation to create buoyancy. Hot air rises out, fresh air enters below, and the ventilation loop continues while the sun shines. Engineering studies have shown that well-designed solar chimneys can generate substantial air change rates. Yet mechanically, the idea remains almost primitive. A vertical shaft, a heat-absorbing surface, an opening at the top, no rotating machinery, no compressor, no complicated electrical system. Just heat, being used to move air. Design #18. Cupolas and roof monitors. Look at the roof of an old barn, courthouse, or grand Victorian home, and you may notice a small tower sitting directly on the highest ridge. That structure is the cupola. Today, many cupolas are decorative. They are sealed. Their windows don't open. They exist mainly to reproduce the appearance of older architecture. Originally, however, the cupola was often a working exhaust valve. Inside any closed building, warm air naturally rises. Eventually, much of that heat accumulates near the highest part of the structure, especially beneath the roof. During a hot summer day, the space directly below the roof decking can become extremely hot. That heat then radiates toward the ceiling and rooms below. A working cupola gave the hottest air somewhere to escape. Located at the highest point of the building, it contained operable windows or louvers on multiple sides. As warm air rose into the attic and collected beneath the roof, it continued upward into the cupola and passed outside. That ongoing release created a gentle upward draft through the structure. As hot air left through the roof, fresher air could enter through lower windows. In larger buildings, builders expanded the same principle into roof monitors. Instead of one small tower, a raised structure ran along the ridge of the roof. Rows of operable windows lined the sides. The entire upper section of the building became a long exhaust channel. Heat collected high. Openings released it. Fresh air entered below. The building continuously ventilated itself through natural buoyancy. Then mechanical air conditioning became standard. Attics became increasingly sealed. Cupolas became decorative. And eventually, many houses began relying on powered attic fans to perform a job that operable high-level openings had once accomplished through simple physics. Section 10. Quantum Cooling, Mashrabias and Sky Radiators. Our final section explores some of the most unusual passive cooling strategies in architectural history. These systems worked at very different scales. One manipulated tiny air openings and evaporation. The other used the night sky itself as a place to release heat. Design #19. Mashrabia/Jolly Screens. With wet jars across North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of India, traditional buildings often feature beautiful screens made from carved wood or stone. One of the most famous forms is the mashrabia. Today, people often admire these structures mainly for their intricate patterns, but traditionally, they performed several environmental functions at once. The lattice created shade, while still allowing light and air to pass through. When wind reached the screen, it had to move through a large number of small openings. The geometry of those openings helped break up and redirect the airflow entering the room. Instead of one large blast of air through a wide opening, the screen created many smaller moving streams. At the same time, the porous wooden structure interacted with changes in humidity throughout the day. But the most remarkable cooling effect appeared when the mashrabia was combined with water. Families could place porous, unglazed clay water jars directly behind the screen. Because the clay remained slightly permeable, moisture slowly migrated through the walls of the vessel. The outside surface of the jar stayed damp. Now imagine hot, dry air entering through the lattice and moving across those wet surfaces. Water begins evaporating. Evaporation requires energy. That energy comes from the heat in the surrounding air. As water changes from liquid into vapor, it absorbs a large amount of latent heat. The air passing into the room becomes cooler while gaining moisture. A simple carved screen and a porous clay jar effectively became a primitive evaporative cooling system. No pump, no compressor, no electrical fan, just shade, airflow, clay, and water working together. Design #20. Steve Baer's Water Walls, Sky Radiators. Our final design uses one of the strangest cooling principles on this entire list: radiative cooling to the night sky. To understand the idea, look upward. On a clear night, a warm surface on Earth can release infrared radiation toward the sky. In effect, the surface is able to dump part of its stored thermal energy upward into the much colder environment beyond it. During the 1970s, inventor and engineer Steve Baer explored how that natural process could become part of a residential heating and cooling system. The concept became associated with the Skytherm house. Large containers or bags of water were positioned directly above the occupied rooms on a flat roof structure. Above the water sat movable insulated roof panels. The house was operated through a daily cycle. At night, the insulated panels were moved aside. The water was exposed to the clear night sky. Overnight, the stored heat within the water could radiate upward while the water cooled. Then, near dawn, the insulated panels were moved back into place. The chilled water was now protected from direct sunlight. Throughout the following hot afternoon, that cooler mass of water remained above the occupied rooms. As interior heat rose toward the roof, the metal roof structure conducted that energy into the cooler water above. Instead of a mechanical compressor constantly extracting heat from the building, the house used nighttime conditions to prepare a cold thermal reservoir for the next day. At sunset, the roof opened again. The stored heat was released toward the night sky. Then the cycle repeated. It was almost like charging a battery every night, except instead of storing electricity, the system stored coolness. Conclusion. We've now explored 20 forgotten cooling designs that helped generations of people live through brutally hot summers long before modern air conditioning became normal. But there's still one enormous question. How did so much of this knowledge disappear? VC 1850s rebranding, the Great Design Deception. As we touched on at the beginning, passive cooling didn't simply disappear overnight because every older idea suddenly stopped working. During the 1950s, residential air conditioning became commercially practical on a much larger scale. That changed the economics of home design. If families continued building houses with deep porches, tall ceilings, operable transoms, double-hung windows, large roof overhangs, and massive thermal walls, those homes could remain naturally comfortable during much of the year. Mechanical cooling might only be needed during the most difficult periods. But manufacturers, installers, developers, and power companies had a very different financial incentive. The more homes depended on mechanical systems, the larger the market became. The building industry began changing. Ceilings became lower. Transoms disappeared. Windows became more tightly sealed. Roof overhangs became smaller. Attic ventilation changed. Many passive features that had once been considered essential gradually became associated with older architecture. At the same time, advertising promoted a new idea of modern comfort. The ideal modern house was sealed from the outside climate. Instead of adjusting the building to the weather, a mechanical system would maintain the same indoor environment regardless of what was happening outdoors. Within a single generation, much of the everyday knowledge required to operate a naturally ventilated house disappeared. People no longer needed to know when to open the windows, when to close the shutters, when to lower the awnings, when to vent the upper floor. The compressor handled everything, and with that convenience came dependence. We traded much of the intelligence built directly into architecture for equipment that needed electricity every hour it operated. The ultimate behavioral design, the night flush ritual. But perhaps the most powerful cooling strategy from the pre-air conditioning era wasn't made from brick, wood, clay, or water. It was a habit. Our great-grandparents might have simply called it opening and closing the house. Today, building scientists call it night flush cooling. The routine followed the natural temperature cycle. At dusk, once the outdoor air became cooler than the air trapped inside the house, everything opened: windows, doors, transoms, high vents, attic openings. Cool night air began flowing through the structure. Hour after hour, that moving air pulled stored heat out of plaster walls, hardwood floors, masonry fireplaces, furniture, and other heavy materials inside the home. The building gradually cooled along with the night. Then came the most important part. Before sunrise, the process reversed. Windows closed, curtains were drawn, shutters covered exposed glass, awnings dropped into position. The cooler air and cooled thermal mass were locked inside before the daytime heat returned. Instead of starting the morning with walls and floors already warm, the house began the day from a cooler baseline. Throughout the afternoon, the structure slowly absorbed heat. The goal wasn't to maintain one perfectly fixed indoor temperature. The goal was to delay the heat long enough to reach evening. Then the house opened again. Cool night air flushed the heat away, and the cycle started over. In a building with substantial thermal mass and favorable nighttime temperatures, this daily rhythm could keep the indoor temperature dramatically below the hottest outdoor peak, without consuming electricity. The hybrid future, working with nature, not against it. So where does that leave us today? On survival routes, the answer isn't to abandon modern technology and move backward into some primitive version of the past. The answer is to become smarter about how we use both old knowledge and modern equipment. The future is hybrid design. We don't need to throw away our air conditioners, but we also don't need houses that become completely unlivable the moment the power disappears. Bring back exterior shade. Restore operable windows. Use night ventilation when conditions allow. Keep direct summer sunlight away from the glass. Design rooms so air can actually move through them. Use porches, overhangs, shutters, thermal mass, and high-level exhaust openings wherever they make sense. Even combining 3 or 4 of these forgotten ideas can reduce the amount of work the mechanical cooling system has to perform. Instead of asking the air conditioner to fight every single watt of heat entering the house, let the architecture remove part of the load first. This weekend, you could install a canvas awning or shade over a sun-blasted western window. You could restore an old double-hung window so both sashes move again. You could experiment with the night flush ritual by opening the house after outdoor temperatures fall and closing it again before the next day heats up. The principle behind all of these ideas is the same. Put intelligence back into the structure. When the house itself shades the windows, moves the air, delays heat, vents hot air, and takes advantage of cooler nighttime temperatures, the mechanical system no longer has to do everything. That can mean lower cooling loads, lower utility bills, greater resilience, and a house that remains far more tolerable if the electrical grid ever fails during a severe summer heat wave. We spent decades trying to overpower nature with bigger machines. Maybe the next step isn't building an even bigger machine. Maybe it's remembering how to make the building work with the climate again. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these 20 forgotten cooling designs surprised you the most? Does your house still have old transom windows, working shutters, a deep porch, or even a forgotten sleeping porch? And which of these ideas would you actually try in your own home? Drop your answer in the comments, because those conversations help shape where we go next as we continue exploring the lost engineering hidden inside ordinary buildings. If this video gave you something valuable, hit the like button, subscribe to Survival Roots, and share it with someone who's preparing to spend a fortune cooling their house this summer. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep your roots deep and your shelter strong. I'll see you in the next one.